for you today, I hope. Right, we're recording. Thank you. Let's mute everybody. Today we are going to learn a few lines of Gemarah, but I'm also going to educate you, I hope, on the laws of kashrut. I am going to tell you all the things that you have always wanted to know about kashrut, and I've been too embarrassed to ask. Remember, there used to be a Woody Allen film of some description that had a title like that back in the 70s. Right, let's get into the Gemarah, and you'll see where it takes us. Okay, let's get the Gemarah on the screen and then share the screen. I'm getting quite good at this now. Right, there we go. Right, so where we left off last week was over here. Say, wisdom, you are my sister. And we were saying that the judges had to be so clear in their mind of what the verdict was, that it was, as we said earlier on here, as clear as daylight. In other words, execute justice in the morning. And we said that means it has to be as clear to you as the morning. And I suspected that this was the origin of the first or the earliest written example of the expression as clear as daylight. And then another rabbi said, it needs to be as clear to you that your sister is your sister. And that's how clear you have to be in your mind. And that's where we left it last week. So now we're going to talk about the responsibility that a judge has when he's sitting. Now, Amar Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi. Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi says, Asara sheyoshvin badin. If 10 judges are sitting in judgment. Now, I'm going to ask Julia, we're going to stop just there, and I'm going to ask Julia, what, Julia, is the problem with that statement there? If 10 judges are sitting in judgment. We can't hear you. Unmute, Julia.
Well, we've always been looking at the number 3 for the number of judges.
That's right. Where's 10 all of a sudden come from? I knew you'd know that answer. That's why I asked you. You're right. The whole thing is Dinei Maimonot Bashlosha. That's what this whole chapter's called. The judges of monetary judgments, which is what we're talking about here, monetary cases, are judged by 3 judges. So where's this suddenly got 10 judges from? Well, it turns out that it's not Dinei Maimonot Bashlosha. All that stuff that we've just spent a year learning turns out not actually to be true. And it's not the case that 3 judges judge a case of 3. It seems that 3 judges minimum are required for these kind of laws. But if you have a look over here, what the note says over here is that although a court composed of only 3 judges is a full court, the more scholars one adds to participate in judging the case, the better. So it seems that when we said right at the beginning those very first words, Dinei Mamonot Bishlosha, monetary matters are judged by 3, what we should have said was monetary matters are judged by at least 3. And it seems that what used to happen was they would have a court case and people would come to the court and they would hang about the court. Probably it was good entertainment. And they would watch the cases and see what was going on. I suppose that happens today. You have a public gallery, people come and watch what's going on. The difference is that the judges would spot a Talmid Chacham in the audience, or 2 or 3 or 4, and say, oh, you're a clever fellow, come and sit with us in judgment. And they would expand the court beyond the minimum 3 that was required. And this is what it seems to have happened here. he says here, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi says, if 10 judges are sitting in judgment, so that is telling us that there is a situation where there could be 10. So what's happened here is you've got a court of 3, and they've added on a bunch more judges. And he says a prisoner's collar. Look at the Hebrew words. Interesting, not actually Hebrew. Collar. Collar. Can you see that word there where my pointer is? Collar, which is a collar. And perhaps this is one of the earliest examples of words being inserted into the Hebrew language, much as we've done in modern Hebrew. Televizia is not a Hebrew word, for example. So collar, talui batsavar kulan. A collar is hanging around their neck. What does it mean by a collar hanging around the neck? Well, Rav Steinsaltz very nicely brings us a little picture here. Here is a relief example of Roman slaves connected by collars around their neck. So we will have seen in various American movies road gangs who are chained up by their ankles. Well, it seems that the Roman slaves were chained up by their neck, and they used these collars. So that's what he's referring to here. So if you've got these 10 judges, each one of them has a prisoner's collar around his neck, meaning that each one of the 10 judges is responsible for the consequences of making a mistake. Well, you're going to say to me, and that's what the Gemarah asks us, pshita. This is something you see very often in the Gemarah. One sec, Leon, I'll come to you in one sec. Pshita. It's obvious. Surely that's obvious, says the Gemarah. Surely it's obvious that all the people involved in the judgment are responsible jointly for the judgment. And in a sec, we'll see why the Gemarah says, no, it's necessary for that to be actually spoken out rather than assumed to be the case as obvious. Yes, Leon?
From what you say, Johnny, the first impression I got, going back to this 10 judges, the first impression I got from that was this was another example of, oh, millions of people followed them to the battle, or thousands, that it was just a mere number, even if you had as many as 10 judges. So in fact, you're saying, I was wrong, and you're saying that the minimum is 3.
Yeah, I think the minimum is 3, and I think 10. I think they're using 10 here as a big number, a bit similar to what you're saying. I don't think it specifically means any number, because what we're going to see in a second, in literally in a second, is that you could add in 1, you could add in 2. Depends who you see. You know, if you're the judge, right? If let's say I was on a bet din, right, and I'm judging a case, and in walks Ravido, right, into the public gallery. I'm going to see him, and I'm going to say, "Oh, Ravido, come and join us in the judgment. We could use your knowledge. We could use your expertise in this case." But you know, if somebody else walked in, I don't know, Philip, for example, I'm not going to invite him to come and sit on the base din, am I? So I think it depends who's there. And I think you're right that 10 is used here just as if you like, a number plucked out of the air. I don't think it has any significance other than to say that what we thought all along is actually, when we get down to the nuts and bolts of it, is not quite the way we thought it was. And that's the beauty of this. It's a bit like a mystery novel, learning Gemarah, because you start off with one premise, and you keep taking in all sorts of different directions, a bit like an Agatha Christie novel. And eventually, at the end of the Gemarah, we hope that everything is drawn together and we get to know who done it. But that's how it seems to be to me, because we've been going along this happily, thinking that 3 judges judge monetary cases. And it seems from this that you can add on willy-nilly whoever you like. but I agree with you. I don't think 10 is anything other than just an example. Yes, Marcel.
10 is an even number. That's strange.
I also thought that as well, Marcel, and I suspect that if they had 10 or any even number, they would then pull somebody else in to make it an odd number. You have to, because we know Ein Beit Din Shakul. We can't have an even number. You're quite right. I also thought the same thing when I read this, and it could well be. I don't know. Maybe David Marks will be able to tell us, because he learned Gemarah Sanhedrin all the way through. Maybe it's the case that these extra judges who come in don't actually get a vote. It may be that they are just brought in for advice to the bench, as it were, and then the verdict is given by the 3 original judges. I don't know. I'm not sure. That raises it raises an issue, but it does say Asara Yoshvin Badin, 10 who are sitting in judgment. So I'm not sure that what I've just said is right or not, but I certainly also thought of that problem, that it's an even number. They would have to have an odd number somewhere along the line, because we know we can't have a Bet Din Shakul. So yeah, I agree with that question. I don't have a definitive answer at the moment. Yes, Howard.
Well, I think what it's saying is, as long as you've got a minimum of 3, even if you have a minyan of 10 judges, they all bear responsibility. There are no supernumeraries. If they're there, they're responsible. It spells it out. It's express.
Yeah, that's exactly what he's saying. And again, I don't think that the number 10 is prescriptive in any way.
Symbolic.
Yeah. Okay.
Maybe it's
Johnny?
maybe it
Johnny?
gives the opportunity to not make a mistake. 5 and 5. Once it's 5 and 5, what happens?
Yeah, I think once it's 5 and 5, then you're going to either have to bring somebody in, as we say in the Shlosh Esrei Midot. If you've got an even number, you have to bring somebody in to give that balance.
Okay, so maybe that's the idea with this, to make sure, because it says the responsibility and consequences of an incorrect verdict. It may be a safeguard.
Well, that's exactly what it is. People are what people want to, and you'll see that. They'll come back to that in a sec, Nachum. You're going to see exactly that. Yes, Morris.
Johnny, wouldn't they have maybe like a chief justice who would have a casting vote in a situation like that?
It seems that the in certain situations the Rosh Sanhedrin would have that as we would call the casting vote. But generally speaking, all the things that we've seen up till now in this Gemarah have pointed us away from having an even number of judges. We've been very careful in all the deliberations of how we work out who's what and who's belonging to which court, how many we have for what court, to go to great lengths to make sure we have an odd number. So it's definitely not a thing to have an even number. I need to look into this a bit more, because the Rosh Sanhedrin definitely was the one who would have a deciding opinion, but it's very clear that they didn't want to rely on that. It's very clear that they wanted to have an even number, and I'm surprised that here. I need to look into it. I haven't gone into it in detail. I need to go and see what all the commentators say about this Gemarah, where it says about 10 judges, because the question that Marcel raised, which is what we're discussing now, is really a very clear question, which we need to establish. And I'll make some inquiries and come back to you with what I find on that. Okay,
Johnny.
So, yes, Larry.
Yes, I was going to say, in the U.S., you always have an odd number, but just recently, when they were awaiting the new justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, they ended up with just 8 active judges, and when the vote was tied, the lower court decision simply remained. The other thing I was going to say is, the word collar is often used, particularly in New York. When the police arrest somebody, they talk about collaring him or her.
Yeah, yeah, I think, yes, that's right. We have that in England as well, slightly differently. We
Felt
say,
his collar. We say
yeah,
felt his collar.
you've had your collar felt. Yeah, if you've been caught, you've had your collar felt. Yeah. So, but I think that comes from the policeman sort of grabbing your neck, the
Yes.
collar of your shirt, and saying he's felt your collar. You know, you've been collared. So it may well be. It may well be from that. Yeah. Thank you for that. Right. Let's have a look and see what the Gemarah says about this. So, Pshita, it's obvious. Surely it's obvious that whoever's sitting in judgment, whether it's 3, 10, or 110, everybody is responsible. And the Gemarah says, lo, no, it's not the case. Tzricha, it is necessary to tell us this. It's not obvious. Why is it necessary? Tzricha ella, it's necessary because we need to know letalmid hayoshev lifnei rabo. We mentioned this a few weeks back. A pupil who is sitting, a student is sitting in front of his Rebbe, might think that it is not respectful for him to pipe up and say that he thinks that his teacher has got it wrong, because we know that one must not give a judgment in front of his teacher. We've already learned that. But there seems to be a tension here, because we also learnt that somebody who hears his teacher make a mistake in judgment has a responsibility to speak up. And that's what this is telling us. This is telling us that a student who's sitting in front of a teacher and noticed that his teacher made a mistake, even if he's not part of the court, he's in the audience, then he bears responsibility if he remains silent. Now this, to me, I don't know about what you've thought about this. This sounds to me a recipe for a complete balagan, because you've got the judges and they make their verdict, and somebody in the audience says, well, I think you're wrong. I think you're wrong. And he has to pipe up and say, well, I think you're wrong. Otherwise, if I don't pipe up, I've got responsibility for the wrong judgment. So you can imagine. And then somebody else will say, no, I think you're wrong. And it just seems to me that it will just descend into a total chaos. So I'm not quite sure how this would work. But this is, nevertheless, this is what the Gemarah says, that a student who is sitting in front of his teacher in the court, he has to correct him if he thinks he's made a mistake. How he would do that, I'm not sure. Whether he would send a little note to the clerk of the court to pass it through to the judge, I've no idea. But it sounds to me a bit of an odd thing, this, that somebody in the public gallery can pipe up and say that they think the judge is wrong, and even if that person is a student of the judge. So this is what it says in the Gemarah, but I'm struggling in my head to visualize how this is going to work without it descending into chaos. Yes, Marcel.
It's interesting that it uses the word talmid there. It doesn't use a tzibor or ploni. Well,
I think it's a kal v'chomer, Marcel. I think it's a kal v'chomer, because you might think that a talmid in the face of his Rebbe has to be quiet.
Yeah.
So if a talmid has to speak up, how much more so somebody who is not a talmid must speak up.
Yeah.
So I think it's a kal v'chomer. I think it's saying that even a talmid who you might think must keep his mouth quiet because he's not allowed to say something in front of his Rebbe, even he has to speak up. So certainly somebody who is not a talmid would have to speak up if he thinks he's made a mistake. And as I said, to me, that sounds like a recipe for a complete balagan. But let's be that as it may, that maybe that was how it worked. Maybe that was, there was a whole big balagan. And then the judges listened to everybody's opinion and then they made their judge. I don't know. I've no idea. Yes, Howard, have you got a thought on that?
No, I have one that might be a bit remote, but I'm just wondering whether you ever had the experience of sitting before judges and hearing them or lecturers and hearing them getting it wrong, and you spoke up. Would you? I don't think I ever would.
Not in a court, I wouldn't.
Not in a court, especially.
You'd be in contempt if you did that, wouldn't you?
Yes, but there is there is a story of Niels Bohr, the great Danish physicist, who was lecturing, huge lecture hall, and Werner Heisenberg got up and said, "You got that wrong," and they became the firmest of friends.
Well, that's the greatness of the person to accept that when he's got it wrong. Let's carry on because I want to get to the interesting bit. So that's the situation. Everyone's got responsibility. And now on the basis of that, we're going to go a bit further forward. Rav Huna, ki hava ate dina lakame, whenever a case would come before him, look what he would do. Michnif umaite asara rabanan mibei Rav. He would deliberately go and get himself 10 rabbis from Rav's study hall. Okay, so that means if he goes and gets 10 plus him, that's 11. So we've got our odd number. So we're okay with that. But he would go and get 10 people, and he would say, Amar, he would say, Ki heiche dilemiltayin shiba mikishura. He would say, I'm doing this so that only a splinter from the wood, from only a splinter will reach us. In other words, the more judges there are, the more we share the responsibility for getting it wrong. So if the punishment is that, I don't know, in heaven, the punishment's 100 lashes. Well, if there's 10 of us, we're only going to get 10 each because we share the responsibility. That's what he's saying. What he's saying is, but you'll see that there's another explanation to it in a minute. What he's saying at this point is that I'm going to get everybody around me so that if we all get it wrong, then we share the responsibility and we'll share the punishment. Yes, Leon?
It's cowardice, in my view, that.
Well, that may well be cowardice. Yes, I think you could argue that it's cowardice. You could argue, however, what another opinion is, and that is that it's humility, and that he wants to make sure that he's not out of kilter, if you like, with other great rabbis. So, one man's meat is another man's poison. Either way, that's what he used to do. And this is the bit that I want to get to now. This is the interesting bit. And then he says, similarly, with Rav Ashi, ki hava ate treifta lakame. When somebody would come to him with a shaila on treifus, you bring some kind of non-kosher situation, a treifa. He would bring in all the butchers of the place where he was. This place, Mata Machasya, was a place. And he would bring in all the butchers and consult with them before he gave an opinion. Now that's slightly different to what Rav Huna did. Rav Huna went and got a whole bunch of people to help him make the judgment. What Rav Ashi has done is he has brought forward a whole bunch of expert witnesses. He has gone and got all the butchers who would know about these things and asked them their opinion before he makes the judgment. And then he says, well, he says the same thing. That way, only a small part of the responsibility will reach all of us. In other words, he's saying, I have done everything I possibly can to get this right. I've brought in all the expert witnesses that are available to me to help me make this judgment. And then if I get it wrong despite that, well, then I can be excused for that, and I will have far less responsibility than if I'd taken this upon myself without asking for expert advice. Yes, Howard.
I've got a real problem with this. How can you have meat from an animal that's not yet dead? If it said that had died from a wound within 12 months.
I'm so glad that you asked that question, Howard. I could have planted that question. The reason I'm so glad you asked that question is this is what I want to spend the rest of the shir on now, is what we're talking about here. So you have led me in beautifully to that. You can see this word Treife here. Now, if I were to ask you, what is Treife? Okay, what would you say? Okay, let's see. Michael Kraus, what is Treife?
Pig.
Okay, right, pig. Thank you. Does anybody disagree that pig is Treife?
Oh, no.
Howard, you disagree?
No, I don't disagree. What I would say is Treife is that which is not kasher.
Okay, Howard says Treife is that which is not kasher. Okay, I'm coming to you, David Marks, in a minute. Anybody else, apart from David, want to disagree with Michael Kraus that pig is Treife? Me, I want to disagree. Because pig is not Treife. Pig is something else. David Marks, what is pig?
It's forbidden to eat, but not because it's Treife. Treife is from.
So what do we call it? What do we call pig?
Tameh.
Tameh. That's right. We call pig tameh. There are 4 ways that meat can be not kosher. Okay, 4 ways. First of all, it can be from a non-kosher animal, like a pig. And that is called tameh, impure. And I am going to show you that. If you don't believe me, I'm going to show it to you on the screen. I don't know, can you see my screen now? Yeah, this is from Vayikra, chapter 11. There it is in blue for you. I'll read it to you because I don't think Leon will have it ready. These you shall not eat among those that bring up the cud and those that have a cloven hoof. Right, so we've got the signs of a kosher animal, cloven hooves and chews the cud. We all knew that, right? What if it doesn't do those 2 things? The Torah says, Tameh hu lachem. It is unclean for you. So a non-kosher animal is called tameh. Okay, tameh. It's not called treif. Colloquially, it's called treif. We understand colloquially the word treif to mean exactly what Howard said, not kasher. But that is a very inaccurate and inexact use of the word treif. It's a colloquialism. A pig is not a treifa animal. It is an unclean animal. It is tameh. So that's the first way meat can be not kosher. The animal's not kosher. What's the second way an animal can be not kosher? Is if you take a kosher animal which is not tameh. So the opposite of tameh is tahor, pure. So a kosher animal is called a behema tahora, a pure animal, a kosher animal. Okay, so a cow is a behema tahora. So how can a cow be not kosher? It can be not kosher. The meat of a cow can be not kosher in 3 ways. So we've got the first way, which is tameh. Now we've got a cow, which is tahor. Tell me one way which a meat of a cow can be not kasher. Stanley.
A mum.
Stanley.
A blemish.
You're muted. You're muted, Stanley. We can't hear you. You're muted.
If it's not shechted properly.
It's not shechted correctly.
It's not shechted correctly, yes. If it's not shechted correctly. And what is that called? Is that called treif?
Yes, it's called treif.
No, it's not. No, it's not called treif. David Marks, what's that called? When it's not shechted correctly, it's not called treif, it's called something else.
Pass.
It's called nevela.
Nevela, yeah.
It's called nevela, and that comes from over here. Have a look at my screen again. This is from Sefer Dvarim, chapter 14, and there it is. Lo tochlu kol nevela. You shall not eat any carcass. Now that means any animal which is a kosher animal, a tame animal, a pig, can never be nevela. A nevela can only be a pure animal, an animal that could be kosher. So a cow, which is a carcass. Now, a carcass means something that's not had proper shechita. So when you, not you, of course, when a person goes to a non-kosher restaurant and eats a lovely fillet steak there, which has not been shechted according to halacha, you are not eating treif, you are eating nevela. You are eating a carcass. That is what is called nevela. And the Torah tells us, you shall not eat any carcass. You may give it to the stranger. Listen to this very carefully. You may give it, I'll do the emphasis, you may give it to the stranger who is in your cities, that he may eat it, or you may sell it to a foreigner, for you are a holy people to the Lord your God. Okay, so we're talking about nevela. So it's an animal that has not been shechted correctly. You might find a cow dead in the refet or in the field, or you may shecht it and find out that your knife wasn't right, or you may think that you are allowed to shoot it through the head and kill it that way. Either way, it's not been shechted according to halacha. That is called nevela. That is called a carcass. Now, interestingly here, look at this. You can give it to a stranger who is in your cities, or you can sell it to a foreigner. Look at the Hebrew. I'll take off the blue. Lo tochlu kol nevela. You shall not eat any nevela, any carcass. Lager, to the stranger, asher bisharecha, who is in your gates, titanena. You can give it. Va'achala, and it can be eaten. Or mechor lenochri. Well, how do we normally translate a nochri? We say it every morning in davening, or some people do have it in their nusach. Shelo asani nochri.
A non-Jew.
A non-Jew, correct. So what's a ger here? What's this ger?
Stranger.
What's this ger that you can give this carcass to?
Well, it's not a
A
convert.
convert?
Why? How can you give a carcass to a convert?
No.
Can't be a convert, can it?
No.
Is a person from another nation?
Okay, so now this is the beauty of learning Gemarah, because we are doing a Gemarah here. We're going off at tangent upon tangent. It's brilliant. I love it. So we are now going to have to understand what is a ger. Now, there are two types of ger in the Torah. There is the convert who is accepted into the Jewish people for all purposes, except that they can't marry a Kohen. And they also, by the way, can't become a judge, but that's something else that we will talk about later on in Sanhedrin. But to all intents and purposes, a full convert is a full Jew in all respects. And that is called a ger tzedek. A ger tzedek. You may have heard that expression. Literally, it means a righteous stranger. It means somebody who has come from outside and has taken on what we call ol malchut shamayim, the yoke of heavenly kingdom. In other words, taken on all the mitzvot. If he's a man, he's had brit milah, and if he's a man or a woman, he's had tevilah in a mikveh, so that he is symbolically purified from his previous status as a non-Jew, and he's then a ger tzedek. That is clearly not what we're talking about here, because a ger tzedek, he's not allowed to eat a nevela any more than you or I are. So it can't mean a ger tzedek. So you have to understand that there is another type of ger. We are talking about here a ger toshav, a ger toshav. And I've deliberately, I don't think you can see it because it's very small on the screen, but I've deliberately showed you the Rashi on this pasuk. The Rashi explains to us, Rashi has the same question as us. How can this ger eat a nevela? and he says, Ger Toshav. It's called a Ger Toshav. It's a resident alien, it's translated as here. This is somebody who has come along to the Jewish people and lives amongst us, and who has accepted upon himself not to be an idol worshipper. But he has not accepted upon himself the Ol Malchut Shamayim, the Kabbalat Ol Mitzvot. He's not accepted upon himself to become a fully fledged Ger Tzedek, to keep all the mitzvot. He lives amongst us, and he has agreed not to worship idols. I suppose this might be like, I don't know, maybe you've got a Filipino carer who's a Buddhist. Now, Buddhism is proper Avodah Zarah. They actually have idols and stuff like that. According to Jewish thought, Buddhism is proper Avodah Zarah. It's a machloket whether Christianity is or isn't, and Islam is not Avodah Zarah. But Buddhism, L'kol hadeot, according to every opinion, is Avodah Zarah. Now, let's say you've got a Buddhist who you are coming to live with you, and that person, and you say, I'm sorry, you can't be going worshipping idols if you're living with me. I don't mind if you eat, your shrimp and all that kind of gear, but you can't be going worshipping idols. That would be the equivalent sort of thing of a Ger Toshav. And this would be, back in the day, you would have groups of people who would come and align themselves with the Jewish people when they were living in the land of Israel, but they would not be Gerim Tzadikim, they would not be proper converts, and they had the status of Ger Toshav. Now we've learnt, not only have we learnt about the halachot of kashrut, which we're in the middle of, but we now understand that there are two types of Gerim, Ger Tzedek and Ger Toshav. Now, the Ger Toshav that lives with you, look what you can do with this nevela. You can give it to him, but you can't sell it to him. Very interesting. You can only sell it to a fully fledged non-Jew. The next bit of the pasuk, O mechor lanochri. You can sell it to a non-Jew, but you can't sell it to a Ger Toshav. This Ger Toshav, this resident alien, as is translated here, is a sort of halfway house between a non-Jew and a Jew. It's a funny sort of status that doesn't really exist today. But back in the day, there was this sort of status of Ger Toshav, and they were sort of part of our community. And therefore, it was not right that you would sell him this nevela. You had to give it to him. If you wanted him to have it, you had to give it to him. You weren't allowed to sell it to him. The pasuk tells you very clearly you can give it to him, but not sell it to him. So if you're a butcher and you make a mistake with the shechita goes wrong, and what you're left with is a nevela, and you want to sell it because you don't want to make a loss, then you actually have to sell it to a fully fledged non-Jew, not to a Ger Toshav. So I just thought that was a very interesting pasuk for us to look at. So now we know that we've got two types of non-kosher meat. See, I nearly said it myself then. I nearly said treif meat. What I meant was not kosher meat. The first non-kosher meat is from a tamei animal, from a pig or a horse or something like that. And that is not called treif, that is called tamei. The second is where the shechita is not done correctly, and that is called nevela. There are two more. And what would they be? Well, let's go to number 4, and then we'll come back to number 3. Number 4 is at the end of this very same pasuk. Lo tevashel legedi b'chalev imo. 3 times in the Torah, we're told you shall not cook or seethe a kid in its mother's milk. You shall not seethe a kid in its mother's milk. I remember that pasuk from being a kid, and I think I've said a few times in this forum. I have a clue what seethe was at the time. I just knew that whatever it was, you couldn't do it to a kid in its mother's milk. Here, of course, they're translated it a little bit more contemporaneously, and you shall not cook a kid in its mother's milk. So the fourth type of non-kosher meat is meat that is cooked together with milk. That would be your fourth type. Now we've got one missing. We've got the third one missing, which we'll come to in a minute. Yes, Howard.
Well, Julia's too young to remember this, but I remember my mother had a big chunk of wood, and she'd put the meat on it and sprinkle salt on it and leave it for several hours and then wash the salt off, and then it was kosher. Then the meat was kosher. We don't see that today. Young people have no idea about it.
We don't see it, but it is done.
I realise it's done.
You're absolutely right. It's done for us by the butchers. And anybody, I think, of my generation and down would not know how to treat meat which has been shafted correctly in order to extract the blood. That's what that's all about. You have to wash it and salt it. Now, my mother, who is 87 years old, just about remembers doing it when she first got married. Jeffrey and Marcel and our maternal, our mutual grandmother, we will all three of us remember our mutual grandmother doing it in the back scullery there. We would all three of us would remember that from when I was a kid. They were older than me, obviously. But anybody of my generation and down, right, would not know how to do it because certainly in the UK, the butchers do it for you. Now, I'm going to tell you a little funny story about it.
I used to kosher meat.
You used to kosher meat, Julia?
Yes, for about I'm trying to think where we lived, but certainly when we lived in Hull, I was still koshering meat.
Maybe that's because in Hull the butchers didn't do it for you.
No, Johnny in London.
Well, my mother did it. I think my first wife did it, living in South Wales. I think we did it for years before kosher meat.
Go on, David, in London.
When we first got married 40 years ago, we koshered meat. It was revolutionary at the time. Perhaps after 2 or 3 years, the first Cadasia kosher butcher opened in Edgware. And one of the huge benefits was it was the first butcher in town to kosher meat for you.
Right, well, there you are. I think both of you have proved my point. I'm going to ask Avril now. Avril, once I'll come back to you in a second. Avril, have you ever kashered meat?
No, but
right.
I have a vague recollection somewhere here of my mother doing it.
Right, so I am correct because David, I think you're older than me, and Julia, I think. Oh well, you're still older than me. Only just, you know, right? I am correct. My generation and downwards, my age and downwards, my wife never kashered meat. It was always done by the butchers when we got married, long before we got married. We got married 35 years ago, and long before that in Manchester, nobody kashered their own meat. Some of the Haredim still kashered their own meat because they wanted to do it themselves. But generally speaking, nobody did, certainly not in Manchester 35, 40 years ago. It seems that in other places they went on a bit longer. But basically, as Howard says, we don't see it anymore. It's done for us. Yes, Marcel?
You've missed something. You still have to do it for liver.
Oh, okay. That's what I was just going to say.
Yeah, liver is a different issue. We'll come to that maybe later. What I wanted to say to you here is I want to get to the important bit, and that is number 3 that we haven't got to yet. So number 1 was an impure, unclean animal, a pig. Number 2 was a incorrectly shechted pure animal, so a badly shechted or non-shechted cow. Number 4 is meat cooked with milk. And number
is there a particular name for that?
Is there a name for that? Yes, it's called basar v'chalav.
No, isn't it called mukhshe in the butcher? It's called mukhshe, something like that.
No, mukhshar means koshered. Your meat that is koshered is called mukhshar. Okay. So your liver, what you'll see in the butcher, in the liver, it will say lo mukhshar. not kosher.
And I've seen regular meat in the supermarket that says lo mukhshar.
So what, here in Israel?
Yes.
Okay, so that's interesting. I haven't seen that, but that's very interesting. And if that is the case, then you need to be very careful. If you see those words lo mukhshar on your meat, unless it's liver, I suggest you put it back because you won't know how to do it probably. I certainly wouldn't know how to do it without looking it up. So if it says lo mukhshar, that means it has not gone through the kashering process that Howard just described to it. There was the salting and the washing and all that performance. And therefore you should put it back and buy something which is mukhshar.
How would you describe the halachic status of lo mukhshar meat?
I think it's a category of its own, lo mukhshar.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I suppose I'm wrong then. There aren't 4 categories. There are 5, aren't there? There are 5 categories. We haven't done number 3 yet. We've done number 1, we've done number 2, and we've done number 4. And now David and Howard, between them, have brought to our attention a 5th category, which is lo mukhshar, meat which has been shechted correctly. It's not been cooked with milk, and it's not in category number 3, that we're going to come to in a sec, but it's still not kosher to eat because it's lo mukhshar. It's not gone through that process of salting and washing. Okay, so number 3. Yeah, Leon, are you wanting to say something before we go on to number 3?
No, I want to say something about number 3, but I may be wrong.
Go on.
Is it a mum, or is that just for sacrifices?
Okay, you are right and you are right. Okay, mum refers to sacrifices, but the concept that you are referring to is correct. The 3rd category is the category which is called correctly treife, and that is where the word treife in colloquial terms comes from. Strictly speaking, an animal which is a treife comes from the pasuk. David, where's the pasuk before I put it on the screen?
Uvasa treifa lo tochelu. It's in the Pasuk Shmini.
It's in Shemot. It's in Sefer Shemot. But you're right about the words. It's in chapter 23.
So it's Mishpat la kelev tashlichu noto.
That's it.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's right.
In
it's on the screen for you now over here, verse 30. And you shall be a holy people to me, and flesh torn in the field. Basar basadeh treifa. Can you see that word? Treifa. Lo tochelu, shall not be eaten. You shall not eat it. La kelev tashlichun oto. You have to throw it to the dogs. Okay? So treifa, where do we see that word treifa in the Torah? We're about to see it in next week's Sedra, not this week, the following week. Where do we see that word treifa?
Tarof Toraf Yosef.
Tarof Toraf Yosef. Yosef was surely torn to pieces. Remember, the brothers took his coat. They ripped it, they dipped it in blood, they sent it back to Jacob and said, surely my son Joseph has been torn to pieces by a wild animal. Taraf. And it's the same word, treifa. The word treifa means torn to pieces. Now, in this context, in the Torah here, where we're forbidden from eating it, it means an animal that has been killed by another animal in the field. But we extend that to mean a treifa in halacha is an animal, technically is an animal which has a disease which would make it die of its own accord within 12 months. That is the technical expression of treifa. That is the technical explanation of the word treifa. And that's why, Leon, you were right about a mum. Your concept of a mum means a blemish. You were right twice, because you were right that it was to do with a blemish, but you're also right that the word mum refers to a sacrifice, not to an animal. One sec, Marcel, I'll come back to you in a sec. So a treifa, something which is a treifa, if you were being meduyak, if you were being exact, and you spoke about meat that was treif, a treifa, that would be only one situation. A kosher animal, which was shechted correctly, and was then found when it was checked by the shochet to have something wrong with it, which would render it liable to die within a certain period of time, and therefore it is a treifa, and that is not allowed to be eaten. Now, what those different things are that could cause an animal to be in a category of a treifa is all set out over here in this on the screen here, which, as you can see, is the Shulchan Aruch Yoredea, chapter 39, is where all the laws of checking an animal are. Now, this is where it gets really fascinating, because over here, you can see it on the screen here, and I've got it in English as well. This is the Shulchan Aruch. This is the Shulchan Aruch written by a gentleman who I'm sure you've heard of called Reb Yosef Karo, who was of a Sephardic persuasion. Okay, he wrote the Shulchan Aruch, and he says that there are certain things that you have to do with an animal. When an animal is shechted, okay, you have to check certain things, and you don't have to check certain other things. You don't have to check every single organ. That is the halacha. You don't have to go through a complete post-mortem for every animal that is checked. But what the shochet does have to do, or not necessarily the shochet, but somebody in part of the kashrus process has to do, is he does have to check the lungs, because the lungs are where the problems arise very commonly. A problem with the liver, a problem with the stomach, a problem with the kidneys, a problem with the spleen doesn't happen that often. But a problem with the lungs is a common problem. So the rabbi said that every animal which is shechted, and I use the word animal advisedly, I'm talking about animals, not birds. Okay, this only applies to animals, does not apply to fowl, does not apply to chickens, it does not apply to duck, it does not apply to turkey. It applies only to animals. Every animal that is shechted has to be checked by a competent person, and what has to be checked are the lungs. And what the Shulchan Aruch, what Rabbi Yosef Karo sets out, is exactly what lesions in the lung constitutes a treifa and what does not. Now, this is where it gets interesting. There is another person called Reb Moshe Isserles, known as his initials, the Ramah. The Ramah. Now, the Ramah wrote a gloss, wrote a commentary on the Shulchan Aruch. And you can see it here in the Hebrew. You can see over here, the writing is slightly smaller than here. This big writing here is the writing of Rabbi Yosef Karo, known as the Mechaber, which just literally means the author. The author of the Shulchan Aruch is Rabbi Yosef Karo. So anybody who refers to somebody as the Mechaber is Rabbi Yosef Karo. He wrote the Shulchan Aruch. This little writing here, where it says Hageh, which means consider this. This was written by Reb Moshe Isserles, an Ashkenazi posek, and we Ashkenazim, I speak for everybody here except for Marcel. Jeffrey, I'm not so sure about. He's a bit half and half, but Marcel is more of a Sephardi than the rest of us. We all go by the Ramah. Ashkenazim paskin according to the Ramah, Sephardim paskin according to the Shulchan Aruch. Now, why is that important in Treifus? Because the Ramah, the Ashkenazi posek, is much more lenient than the Sephardi posek. The Sephardi posek, Reb Yosef Karo, sets out over here all of this stuff here, all of the outer edge of the lobe and the inner how you've got to do it. He sets out the very strict way that the checker has to check the lungs to make sure that they are clear of lesions that would make it a Treife animal. The Ramah is much more lenient, and he gives a method of checking, of peeling back the lungs in a much more lenient and less thorough way. So what happens is you can have two animals. No, sorry, I beg your pardon. You have one animal. The same animal will be checked by a Sephardi supervisor, and it will be found to be Treife because it's got a certain lesion on it. That animal could be kosher according to the Ramah, and Ashkenazim could eat it. And that, ladies and gentlemen, in a nutshell, is the halachot of Glatt. Okay? Now, if I was to say to you, what does Glatt kosher mean? You will say to me, it means very kosher, right? And it does not mean Glatt kosher. It does not mean very kosher. For example, you cannot have Glatt kosher pizza. You cannot have Glatt kosher fish. You cannot even have Glatt kosher chicken. Okay? You can only have Glatt kosher meat. The word Glatt is Yiddish. And this is the irony of it all, by the way, because you have the Sephardim who say that they only eat Glatt, who don't know Yiddish from, Japanese, and yet they use the word Glatt because they only eat Glatt. And I'll explain to you what the word they should use in a moment. And it's a word that you will see and hear here in Israel. So the word Glatt is Yiddish. Does anybody know what the word Glatt actually means? Anyone? Okay. The word Glatt means smooth. Now, you may have heard the word in Hebrew when people speak about kashrut, chalak. Have you ever heard that? Somebody say, this meat is chalak. Well, chalak is Hebrew for smooth. Chalak is the Hebrew translation of the word glatt. Glatt is Yiddish, and it means smooth. Chalak is Hebrew, and it means smooth. So what is glatt meat? Glatt meat is very simply meat that comes from an animal where the supervisor has checked the lungs to do all the checks that the Shulchan Aruch says, not just what the Ramah says, but what the Shulchan Aruch says, what Rabbi Yasov Karo says he should do. And he has found that the lungs are entirely smooth. They don't have any knobbles on them. They don't have any lesions on them. They don't have any growths on them. And the lungs are entirely smooth. They are glatt. And therefore, that meat can be certified as either glatt, if you speak Yiddish, or chalak, if you speak Hebrew. Now, for a Sephardi to eat non-glatt meat, in other words, meat that has not been checked to see whether it is entirely smooth according to the Shulchan Aruch, is forbidden. A Sephardi must only eat meat which is certified as glatt or chalak. An Ashkenazi can eat meat which is checked only, I say only, it's still a high level, only to the level of the Ramah, because we Ashkenazim paskin according to the Ramah. So you can have a situation, and this is important that you understand this, because there are many people, myself included many years ago, my father of blessed memory used to get really upset with people who would only eat glatt meat. They said, if it's kosher enough for me, it should be kosher enough for you. And we've all felt that and heard that. That's not the case, because Sephardim are not allowed to eat non-glatt meat. It is not allowed for them. It is asur. If you are an Ashkenazi, you can choose to have a higher level of checking, because that's all glatt is. Glatt means that it has been checked and the lungs were smooth. Non-glatt meat does not mean that it was checked and the lungs were not smooth. It means it wasn't checked to the same level as the glatt meat. It was still checked and they found nothing, but they didn't do the extra checks that the Sephardim that Rabbi Yosef Karo said need to be checked. So we have a situation here where there is a glatt. I'll come to you in a sec, Stanley. So I don't want your arm to get tired to be up all that time. We'll come to you in a sec. So to be exact, let's just recap again very quickly. An animal not of a kosher species is called a tamei. An animal of the kosher species which is not shechted correctly is called a nevela. An animal which is shechted correctly but does not meet the requirements, having been checked by a supervisor, either to the level of the Ramah or to the level of Shulchan Aruch, if you are a Sephardi, is called that is called a Treife. It's called Treife, and therefore we can't eat that. The fourth category is basar v'chalav, and the fifth category we would be lo muchshar, not salted and thing. Now, what we do colloquially is we say all of those things are treif. Okay, so when you're saying something is treif, you're not being exact at all. Now, it stands to reason, because I've explained to you now that you know what glatt is, you understand why you cannot have a glatt kosher chicken. You cannot have a glatt kosher turkey, because the lungs are not checked in the same way. Glatt means smooth, chalak, the lungs are smooth. You can certainly not have glatt kosher pizza. I have never seen a smooth pizza. It wouldn't work, would it? So you can't, you can only use the word, if you're being pedantic, you can only use the word treif to mean an animal who has been shechted correctly and found to have a blemish when it's checked. And you can only use the word glatt when you're talking about meat from an animal and not from fowl. First of all, Stanley, and then Avril. Stanley, what did you want to say? Stanley? No, he's busy. Yes, Avril.
Okay, so Chalak Bet Yosef is a Sephardi hechsher.
Right,
So,
Chalak Bet Yosef. Let me explain what's Chalak Bet Yosef. Chalak means glatt, as we've said. Reb Yosef Karo, as well as writing the Shulchan Aruch, also wrote another book. And because his name was Yosef, that book was known as the Bet Yosef. And Reb Yosef Karo is known as the Mechaber, as I just told you, the author. He's also known as the Bet Yosef. So Chalak Bet Yosef means that the glatt checks have been done to the highest level of the Bet Yosef. In other words, following the Shulchan Aruch to the very highest degree. So if you are a Sephardi and you want to eat the best hechsher, you will look for a Chalak Bet Yosef hechsher.
and for Ashkenazim?
For Ashkenazim, it's certainly meritorious to eat Chalak Bet Yosef because it is a higher degree of checking. For an Ashkenazi to eat meat which has not been checked to the level of Chalak Bet Yosef is completely 100% permitted, and nobody should be looked down upon if they, inverted commas, only eat Rabbanut meat, which is not Chalak. Okay, it is very important to know that somebody who says, I only eat Chalak meat, that's absolutely fine. What they should not be doing, and I'm quoting, this is a bit of a hobby horse of mine, but I'm quoting Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, and I've quoted him before. What he should not be doing is imposing his kashrut on you. So, for example, if you are fortunate enough to have a very religious son who says, I will only eat Chalak Bet Yosef meat, he should not expect you, his mother, to go and buy special meat for him. If you choose to do so, that's your business. But when he comes to your house, he should jolly well eat your meat if it is kosher. as long as he's not a Sephardi, because he can't do it if he's a Sephardi. But then if he's a Sephardi, you'd probably be a Sephardi and you couldn't do it either. So what you should not be doing as an Ashkenazi is imposing your high standards on somebody else, on somebody else's cheshbon, on somebody else's account, and certainly not your parents. That is not kibbud av v'ein. If the parent decides that that's what they want to do to make their child happy, that's their business. They can do what they want, but it should not be expected. And Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach himself was asked the question, what would the Rav do if he went to a wedding and he found that the meat was not up to the same level of kashrut that he would normally eat at home? And he said, if I was a guest at somebody's wedding, I would eat that meat, and so should you. Julia's shaking her head because it doesn't happen. You're right, it doesn't happen, but it should happen, and that is something which is very important to know. So for Ashkenazim, coming to you back to you in a sec, Stanley. For Ashkenazim, meat which is from a kosher animal, which is shechted correctly, which is checked to the level of the Ramah, is and found to be okay, is perfectly kosher meat. You want to take yourself a higher standard in the same way as you want to buy a grade A etrog instead of a kosher grade C etrog. That's your business. But don't look down upon somebody that buys a grade C etrog, and don't look down upon somebody who eats rabbanut meat as long as you're an Ashkenazi. Stanley, please, next.
What is interesting, I still remember, because my grandma has always salted meat. And my mother salted meat, because in Russia you couldn't find anything kosher. That's how it was done. I don't know if it was fully kosher, but because my grandma, she shechted by herself, chickens.
Wow,
and
that's interesting.
Salted them.
So your grandmother shechted the chickens and then did all the salting and
yeah, plucked them, salted it, and do all the things.
Okay.
And
anybody else's grandmother shecht chickens? No, I don't think so. I think our great grandfather would have shechted chickens. Yes, Marcel and Jeffrey.
Maybe.
I don't know if it was a shechet.
He was a chicken merchant, anyway.
Chicken merchant for sure.
Okay, Sharon.
A couple questions, Johnny, and everybody else. First of all, when you're talking about Sephardim, what about the Jews from Mizrach, the Jews who were not from Sephardi background, but the Jews from the Babylonian exile and so forth? What about them? Secondly, what is the disease that was being looked for? What were these lesions? Is there a scientific reason for what they were looking for? And is there a reason why there would have been different kinds of diseases among the Sephardim than the Ashkenazim that would account for this difference in halachic ruling?
Okay, let me answer those questions in order. The Eidot HaMizrach would closely would have the older communities, like the Ethiopian communities, which came well before the Shulchan Aruch, and don't even know what the Shulchan Aruch is, or didn't know what the Shulchan Aruch was when they first came. They would have their own interpretations of the halachot, and it would be a situation that both Ashkenazim and Sephardim, if you like, I'll call them standard Ashkenazim and Sephardim, would not be able to eat the shechita from those communities, from let's say an Ethiopian community that came in the 1980s, because we had a totally different interpretation, because we have the Shulchan Aruch, which they didn't have. So they would have their own interpretation. Nowadays, of course, they've been largely integrated into Israeli society, and would almost certainly follow the Shulchan Aruch, the Sephardim, and would only eat Glatt. The second question is what the lesions are. They were adhesions in the lungs. The lungs get stuck together by some kind of tumors. And it wasn't that there was a difference in the places of Ashkenaz and Sfarad. They still had the same things. It was a question of how strict they were going to be about looking for them. They were the same lesions that were there, but the Ashkenazim, perhaps, I don't know, I'm just surmising now, perhaps because it would have been too difficult financially to have made more animals in the Treife category. The Ashkenazim took on less stringent checks. It's not that they had different diseases; they just didn't look for them as hard. Howard, you're muted. Howard, you're muted.
Can we continue with this next week, Johnny? Because I still have several questions.
Yes. Okay. We've run out. I told you it would be interesting today. So there we are. Surma Dinabaran. What are you showing me, Stanley? We can't hear you. We can't hear you.
This is very interesting book on kashrut.
Right.
From Mizrach, from Los Angeles by Rabbi Augustine Hubra.
Yeah, Tzurba Mirabanon is an organization which puts out halakhic treaties on many things, and it's a very good organization. Yeah. Okay, we'll carry on the end of the discussion of kashrut next week. But what I just want to finish, just to summarize, I think that's been instructive in terms of what Treife actually means. So next time you use the word Treife, or you'll hear it used, you can correct them and tell them what they really mean when they say Treife. Okay, and we also now know that there are two types of geirim, one that you can give nevela meat to, and one that you can't. So there you go. Right, I wish you a good week for the rest of the week. We'll carry on with a bit of kashrut next week, and then eventually carry on with the Gemarah in some other subject. So unless anybody's got any further questions, we'll call it a day.
Just one other thing to remind everybody about the Sanhedrin Trail Tour next Wednesday night.
Yeah, I'm going to send out further reminders of all the exciting things, including that, over the next few days.
But people should reserve it at 8 o'clock next Wednesday night, December 9th.
Yeah, it will be sent out as a reminder very shortly, Sharon. Don't worry. Okay, everyone.